Hello everyone, Ailuromage, the Magic History Cat here. Today we will be taking a close look at the Vault, one of the most iconic Heavensward dungeons where we confront the members of the Heavens Ward. Most of what I study is Christianity and church history, and this particular dungeon is one of my favorites in the entire game. This video will mostly focus around the dungeon itself, themes, the design, terms, names of the enemies we encounter, and how these things all relate to real-life churches' titles and architecture. So let's get right into it. The Vault takes place in a massive high fantasy version of a Catholic basilica. Due to its obvious fantastical nature, there isn't any one-to-one comparison to any real-life building, but certainly there are plenty of elements inspired by real life. Ishgard in general is heavily influenced by Gothic architecture, which is that iconic look of sharp apexes, spires, and angular design. Ishgard itself is a theocracy, pulling inspiration from how at one point the Catholic Church essentially was the leading dominant power in Europe. And though this has significantly changed over time, we can still see the roots of this system in the Vatican City today. So we hear the term Holy See a million times in Heavensward, and this is a term used in real life. The term Holy See comes from Latin roots, with see meaning seat, quite literally saying the holy seat in English, and this refers to the leading position within the Roman Catholic Church, which today belongs to the Pope in the Vatican City. Keep in mind, of course, that this is specifically a Catholic practice because Protestants, along with Orthodox, do not recognize the Pope as an authority figure within their own systems. Additionally, similarly to Ishgard, the Vatican City is a city-state. It's not just another city in the country of Italy, it is governed by the Pope and the land belongs to the Holy See. So the Vault takes place within St. Thornton's Basilica. Saints in Catholicism are highly venerated believers of exceptional devotion to Christ that become officially canonized. This is a very meticulous process and requires the official decree of the Pope to be valid. Many basilicas and cathedrals are named after saints, and St. Thornton's Basilica in the game, I'm certain, is this world's stand-in for both St. Peter's and St. John Lateran's, as St. John Lateran's is the Archbasilica and functions as the official seat for the Bishop of Rome, which is the Pope, even though this building is not actually in the Vatican City. St. Peter's Basilica is in the Vatican City, however, and it's probably the most notable one between the two because of its location, and if this sounds confusing, it's because it is. Also, both of these basilicas are not actually Gothic in style, unlike St. Thornton's in the game, and this is most likely just a design choice because Gothic architecture really is that iconic for the medieval fantasy look, and when you think about knights and churches and all of that, I'm confident that Baroque-style architecture is not one of the first things that pops into your head. Ishgard visually doesn't really look much like the Vatican City at all, but the other similarities are undeniable. The closest looking place to Ishgard in real life would be Mont Saint-Michel in the northern part of France. So the closest equivalence to the Pope we have in-game is Archbishop Thornton VII. In real life, the Pope is the Archbishop of Rome. As a very quick side note, without getting too deep into the finer details of this particular topic, a basilica does not itself have to be a cathedral. A cathedral is the primary or quote-unquote mother church of its diocese. The word cathedral comes from cathedra, which means a chair or a throne, and this position is the one presided over by a bishop. I bring all of this up because there is both Thornton's Basilica and a cathedral right next to it in the game. With all this being said, let's finally start at the beginning of the dungeon itself. Again, keep in mind that we're dealing with a high fantasy structure in this game that gets into some crazy crazy scale in both size and design. So we find ourselves dropped right into the vault nave, and in just a few steps we enter the chantry nave. Let's start with this image here, a very basic layout of a cathedral. So the nave is just a large central part of the church, essentially the main room section that spans all the way from one side to the other side of the building. The nave intersects with what is called the transept, which is a smaller crossing section that quite literally forms a cross. If you look at many cathedrals, especially Gothic style ones from above, you can very easily see that cross shape. As we step forward, we are immediately confronted by two enemy types, the first one being the Temple Banneret, and the other being the Vault Ostiary. The Temple Banneret is referring to what is called a Knight Banneret. Now this title can refer to a few things, but generally speaking, a Knight Banneret was a title of prestige given to a knight for any number of reasons. It allowed them to carry their own banner and gave them the authority to raise and command their own company of soldiers. Your standard knight would serve under the banner of another and would answer to a commander. So a Knight Banneret was a step higher than this, but was not among the highest ranks, as they would still serve underneath someone else, such as a duke, a lord, or any other high title such as these. As far as we can tell, Knight Banneret started as an official title in the 13th century. Next is the Vault Ostiary. Historically, an ostiary in a church was the guard at the entrance, the doorkeeper. They would stand watch and ensure entrance to the church was kept under control. So literal gatekeepers. But this was not really a prestigious title, it was more just one of necessity and service to the church. After defeating this little group, we make our way further in and are greeted by the spacious and beautiful interior of the church. We see the pews and the windows with light coming through all the way on the other side of the room. Now I personally wish they would have done something more with these windows and put some kind of pretty stained glass in the back for us to look at. Like a depiction of Halone in stained glass would have been amazing, considering this is a church dedicated to Halone. As cathedrals in real life will have dozens of stained glass panels depicting entire stories, saints, angels, and various sacred art and symbols. Now, although we see plenty of Gothic influence here, especially in the pointed arches and angular design that I mentioned earlier, this space we are in is a little different than what you would see in a typical cathedral space. There is no transept in the structure, and the room itself is just absolutely massive. The gates are also interesting. I have personally been in a dozen European cathedrals, and I have never seen sitting sections gated off quite like this. I assume this is because Ishgard is a very classist society, separating the highborn from the lowborn. So I assume that whenever the church is open to the public for the special celebrations they hold, they probably section everyone off from one another on purpose in this way. That being said, the aisles are present here in game. Looking here, we can see the nave stretching all the way from the narthex to the apse, flanked by aisles on each side. So the narthex, just think of it like the entryway. That's basically what it is. And aisles are literally just that. They're essentially long hallways that run along the sides of the nave, separated by a series of arch entryways for access. Typically, aisles contain various small sections or chambers that can have altars, artwork, statues, confession booths, and various other things the public can interact with. So we enter one of the aisles in game where we hit the second group of enemies, and this is where we encounter the first vault auditor. So the Catholic Church does have auditors, and they do judicial work for the church. Now, historically, they were responsible for collecting evidence, handling documents, presenting information to judges, and would question witnesses and conduct investigations on behalf of the church. Now, if this all sounds a little Inquisitor adjacent, it's sort of sorta like it, and I'm pretty sure that's what the developers were going for with this enemy. Now, as we exit the aisle and re-enter the nave, we encounter the first vault deacon. So a deacon, along with a priest, is a title underneath the bishop in the church. Deacons primarily assist the bishop with various tasks and have important responsibilities, but cannot perform some duties that a priest can. Deacons can perform baptisms, assist in preaching the homily, homily, be a witness to marriage vows, and generally perform upkeep around the cathedral for the altars in various rooms. Unlike priests, however, they cannot perform the sacrament of confession or lead mass, prayer, and liturgy. A deacon can become a priest later, but even so are still very important to the church as they are. After a few more enemies, we make our way up the staircase and reach the choir. This is where we confront, as I like to call him, Sir Philadelphia the Brightblade. In real churches, the choir functions as the stage. It is where the clergy and church choir would sit during mass. Now, in-game, the choir is a very exaggerated structure here for the fantastical presentation as a set piece, but a normal choir will be somewhat elevated by some degree so that the people standing in the space can be seen from afar all the way in the back of the church, and for their voices to carry around the room as well. But it just wouldn't be to this extreme in the vast majority of European churches. Behind the choir is the apse of the church, which is that circular looking part on the back. It's an extension from the church enclosed with a dome-like roof, which will usually have some kind of artwork in the form of stained glass or murals. Depending on the style or size of the church, it can also have what is called an ambulatory. Not every church will have this, but the ambulatory is a walkway that is connected to the aisles that goes around the back of the apse, and there are usually pillars or arches as a means to somewhat give a distinct separation from this walkway to the choir. So the apse will have a beautiful display of massive stained glass to allow the flow of light to enter the church, and this is done for the purpose of lighting the room, and you're supposed to be able to see the stained glass as part of the presentation. I think it's easy to mentally get stuck in our time period with electricity and technology very easily, so it's important to remember that this was done to bring light into this massive structure that would otherwise be completely dark with nothing but candles to light up the space. This is why cathedrals have so many massive windows. Additionally, again, looking at cathedrals and how they are positioned geographically, the apse is on the east side, and this is done for a couple of reasons. One of them being that the early Christian church did pray facing east, so that's how the altar is oriented. And secondly, the sun rises from the east, so during mass, the sun would shine through all of that stained glass on the east side, illuminating the space and showcasing all that beautiful artwork. Again, it's actually a shame the windows in the dungeon are so bland and empty looking here, because right next door to this building in St. Raymonald's Cathedral, which is not positioned with the apse on the east side, but in any case, the stained glass in here is really pretty, with a beautiful statue of Halone in the center of the choir. If it's not obvious by this point, stained glass is pretty much my favorite part of any cathedral. I can't get enough of it, and I wish I could get a stained glass window literally in my bedroom. That would be fantastic. So getting back to Sir Philadelphia, one thing I want to point out is that he uses an attack called Holiest of Holy. This is a reference to an inner part of the tabernacle that the ancient Hebrew people said that the presence of God dwelled within. It was a separated, windowless room that only the high priest could enter, and this was not done very often at all. In fact, it was done once a year for the purpose of offering a sacrifice for atonement for the sins of the people. It was believed that any who entered the space, quote-unquote, carelessly or recklessly, would die in the presence of God. Now, after the battle, we are treated to a nice view of the church from the choir platform, and then we make our way up the stairs. And remember that this is a high fantasy building in the game, so things will start to get more and more exaggerated as we go on, but in any case, we enter the cloister. The architecture here is really interesting and gets a little confusing, as it's really hard to tell from the player's perspective how this building is designed, but the word cloister comes from root words related to closed or enclosure, meaning it is an enclosed space. Cloisters are square-like enclosures, almost always with some form of courtyard or garden in the middle. Using this map of Durham Castle as a cathedral as a reference, so you can kind of get an idea how a cloister would be placed within the architecture of a church and what it would look like. Now, the cloister was a place for the people within the church to rest and relax, and not every cathedral has a cloister, but there are many that that do. So in the game, we don't really see anything like this until later when we go up the lift. But before we get to the lift, we run into the enemy, the Vault Friar. Friars in real life are usually associated with monks, and they sort of are, but there is some nuance here. Historically, using the term monk usually means referring to the older Benedictine monks that started emerging in the 5th and 6th century. They were men who took very intense vows of chastity and asceticism and stayed in the church, usually spending their entire lives in churches, monasteries, and abbeys. Now, friars, similarly to these monks, would take similar vows, but their work extends beyond the walls of the church and are usually supposed to go out on missionary tasks to help the public, teach and preach, and practice the sacrament of the anointing of the sick. Friars in this specific way started emerging more in the 12th and 13th centuries. In any case, it's a clever little nod that the Vault Friars in-game are the monk class as a reference to this. We eventually make our way to the Chantry Lift, where we encounter the enemy, the Face of the Hero. This is purely part of the game's universe, as nothing really relates here aside from it just being a really huge knight in armor. It's a soulkin that I assume is an expression of the might of the church, perhaps even having some kind of historical tie or legacy within the culture of Ishgard. We then take the lift up, and I don't think I need to explain that churches built centuries ago did not have giant concrete elevators that could lift entire groups of people, but we then reach the inner sanctum. Now, this is the part that actually mostly resembles what a cloister would look like in real life. It's a walkway that borders the exterior of a garden that we can see inside, because the term inner sanctum in terms of a church references something else. As a callback to what I mentioned before, this could refer to the holiest of holies, but in reference to the Catholic Church, it would be used to talk about the altar, the seat of the priest, and other things related to the altar that is used for conducting Holy Communion. And it's sacred because this is how the Catholic faith celebrates Christ, through the Eucharist, and the Holy Communion, where the congregation will partake in the body and blood of Christ through the bread and wine. We then encounter our first white and black knight enemies, which are cutely themed after the white and black chess pieces on a board. I'm not sure if there is a deeper theme here aside from them being knights in a church, and playing chess was a popular pastime back then, but perhaps there is more, and feel free to share in the comments if there is, and the same with the Face of the Hero enemy as well. We then enter the chapter house, where we face Sir Grinno the Bull. Now, a chapter house is where the clergy would conduct meetings and share information with each other so that everyone was always on the same page. Again, no phones, no emails, they had to meet every day and discuss with one another. However, it doesn't look like this is where the Heaven's Ward actually holds their meetings, and additionally, that statue of Halone looks exactly like the one we see in the rotunda in the Hall of the Spear, which we will get to. I'm certain these are not the same rooms though, as they don't look the same, but I couldn't help but notice that detail. This is also where the architecture and structure just start to go into full fantasy at this point, as we make our way up the stairs, and we are now above the clouds on stone platforms in the sky. So we enter the rotunda, and many cathedrals will have rooms like this. This mostly resembles a chapel, as they would be more commonly referred to, and a chapel is just a smaller area that can fit smaller groups of people, usually with an altar, statue, or something in the room as a set piece meant for more private prayer, blessings, teachings, and so on. And it's here that we run into a vault priest. As I mentioned before, priests are above deacons in responsibilities, but still serve under a bishop. And what he's wearing is also pretty much just a fantasy version of what real priest attire looks like. We additionally fight a group of 4 gargoyles. Now, you will see statues or carvings of gargoyles on the exterior of many cathedrals. Now, in most cases, if you take a very close look at some of these statues, you will realize they usually function as gutters or waterways of the roof of the church. It was all about presentation and art, and everything had to look pretty, even things that served a practical function. It's said that gargoyles would ward off evil, and in a way they do, but it's a little bit more nuanced than that. It's more so to scare the evil out of you, the person entering the church, that these beasts are what await you for sinful behavior. So it's a bit of a coercive method to remind you of the proper life you should live as you enter the church. And of course, anyone who is a fan of the Disney classics remembers that chilling scene from The Hunchback of Notre Dame as the gargoyle statue breaks, sending Frollo into the flames as punishment for his trespasses. We then finally enter the chancel. At this point, there is really no comparison anymore. We are just in Final Fantasy here on a platform in the sky. Other buildings in the background that seem like a massive safety risk to access. I would not want to work here. In any case, a real chancel just describes the space that contains the choir, pulpit, altar, and so on, mainly referring to the space reserved for the clergy during Mass that the public was supposed to just stay away from. It's like the stage at any concert, it's where all the stuff is. So it's here where we face Sir Charabert, and he uses a series of appropriately themed attacks like Holy Chain and Holy Flames, but he also uses an attack called Altar Pyre. And an altar pyre refers to back when sacrifices were made to God in the ways of the Old Testament, where animals were sacrificed or burned on altars. After a fantastic set piece of a fight to one of the best songs in Heaven's Word, we eventually defeat Sir Backflip and end the dungeon. That was a closer look at the Vault, its terms, themes, architecture, design, and enemies we encounter within the dungeon, and its relation to the real-life Catholic Church. I want to thank you all very much for watching. These sorts of videos take a very long time to put together, so if you enjoyed it, consider leaving a like and telling me what you thought in the comments, and subscribe if you don't want to miss the next one. I really love this dungeon a lot. It's my favorite kind of topic to talk about, and it makes me want to explore a few other parts of Heaven's Word as well. Thank you so much again, and remember to pet a cat today.